And joining us now on the debate for the full hour tonight, in Montreal, Quebec, Adam Daifala, contributor to the National Post. In the nation's capital, Elizabeth Thompson, senior writer at iPolitics.ca, that's her on the left, and Stephanie Levitz, journalist with Canadian Press. In Kingston, Ontario, Kathy Brock, professor of political studies at Queen's University, and with us here in studio, Thomas Walcom, national affairs columnist with the Toronto Star. Grateful to everybody for coming in and sharing your time with us tonight on a very important day in Canadian history. And in case anybody missed it at home, let's just relive some of those seconds from earlier today when history was made on the floor of the House of Commons. Roll tape, please.
All those in favor of the motion will please rise.
Yeas pour 156, 156. Nays contre 145, 145.
I declare the motion carried.
By the government House Leader that the House do now adjourn.
Adjourned it is. The 40th Parliament is over. Off to the hustings they all go. Stephanie, you're there in Ottawa. Let's start with you. You watched it. I'd actually like to, if I can, go around our literal and metaphorical table here with just general impressions from today. What really struck you as you watched the government fall?
One of the things that definitely struck me was the historic nature of the moment, but what a lot of Canadians didn't see was exactly what preceded it. There had been a lot of partisanship in the House the last, week or 10 days, but there was this moment right before the motion where all the MPs were crossing the floor. They were shaking each other's hands, they were saying goodbye, and you sort of got a sense, for them that this is a personal moment in history, not just a political moment in history, and that was something that definitely stuck with me today.
Elizabeth, let me go to you. You were there today as well. What'd you think?
What Stephanie was saying is very apt, because a lot of what you see on the television cameras is the back and forth of question period. You see the cheers, the sort of like the rah-rah. One thing that really struck me during the vote was Bloc MP Francine Lalonde has been battling cancer on and off for the last few years. She's not running again. She is not even well enough to make her farewell speech. When she stood today to vote, the MPs on both sides of the House gave her a standing ovation. I thought that was a very classy thing for them to do.
Adam Daifala, what do you say?
A few things, Steve. One, obviously, was just the inevitability of what happened today. I mean, we've been speculating whether or not this would happen for several weeks now, but it just seemed like it was such a done deal for the last few days. So I think everyone was at peace with it and just knew it was coming. Also, the multi-partisan greetings and farewells to Peter Milliken, I thought was very nice to see, because he's such a wonderful man. And also, for the first time, I wasn't able to watch it live myself. I was at a conference today, so I was following on Twitter. And Steve, you and so many other people were tweeting every single second of this event. And it was really fun and neat to watch this unfold on Twitter, getting second-by-second updates. I really enjoyed that.
I appreciate hearing that. That's nice. Yeah, I went down for it myself today and was really quite moved by all of the things that I've heard already. And I actually want to come back to some discussion of Peter Milliken a little bit later on, but because he is the longest-serving speaker of all time, and we do need to spend a bit of time on him. Kathy Brock, what did you think of what you saw today?
Well, I would agree with the others that the collegiality we saw in the House was really admirable, and the tributes to Peter Milliken were terrific. But what struck me was when you watched them stand up to vote, you could see the happiness on the face of the Liberals and the NDP, but when you looked at the Conservatives, they were serious, and they did not look happy. They expected it, they weren't caught off guard, that's obvious, but they also wanted to register that they were not happy.
Now, why would that be? Because they're in first place. They got a poll out the other day that shows them with a double-digit lead. Why would they not be happy with today's outcome?
Well, they were putting out the message that they really wanted to govern, that they don't think this is a good time to go to an election because of the economy, because of the turbulence around the world. So I think they were trying to stick in character with that message.
Understood. Thomas, what struck for you?
Actually, Kathy's point that, and also you notice that the Conservatives didn't throw confetti into the air. What struck me in a way about this was not the conviviality of the individual MPs, and MPs do get to like one another, but the sense that everybody was playing their part. This thing had ended, finally, and it's been a poisonous parliament, and in some sense I think I was relieved, and I expect everybody there was relieved that it was over.
It's interesting, just for those who don't know, it is a tradition that when the House is dissolved, People take their papers on their desk and throw them up in the air, and sometimes I've seen journalists from the gallery throw paper down on top of the MPs. But you're right.
Not the only time.
Yeah, that did not happen at all. The journalists throwing paper today didn't happen. And you're right. On one side of the House, the Conservative side, no throwing papers at all.
Well, that speaks exactly to the point Kathy was making about the discipline of the Conservatives. They want right from the get-go. They're on message. This was not their idea. I think probably in many ways it was their idea, but they want to make sure that people think it was not their idea.
Adam, let me follow up with you on this. Speaking about the twittering that was going on today, or the tweeting, I watched some of Andrew Coyne's tweets as well, and Coyne, when he saw all of this conviviality on the floor and the genuine hugs and handshakes for everybody, as they knew some of their colleagues obviously would not be coming back, his point was in some of his tweets, look if you people all really hate each other and there really is a toxic atmosphere, then cut out all this handshaking crap. Either you hate each other or it's all theater, but it's not both. Where do you come down on that?
I think it's more on the theater. I think most of them, despite the rancor that we see on a daily basis, particularly in question period, most of the MPs actually like each other, or at least many are friends and at worst acquaintances. And I think some of them genuinely like each other from all different parties. So I'm not sure if I agree with Andrew on that. One comment I'd like to make, though, is about what Thomas and Kathy just said. The Conservatives certainly did put on a stern face today, and I agree completely with Thomas that it was their discipline and part of their messaging to make it look like they didn't want this campaign. But deep down, I think they really did want this campaign, and I think it's actually to their benefit that the election is occurring now. Because if we had waited another 6 months or a year, it would have given a lot more time for the opposition to drag out the various ethics-related scandals and other things into committee hearings and drag them on in the media, which would have probably dragged the Conservatives' poll numbers down. So despite the face that they put on today, I think they were actually quite happy that this happened.
Well, let's follow up on that. Stephanie, do you think the Conservatives secretly are happy that, in fact, the House has had its plug pulled?
Well, definitely. I mean, not all the Conservatives were somber. I believe there were 2 Conservative MPs who gave each other a little fist bump as the vote was going on, a little hurrah, let's go, we're off to the races. And if we go back to Twitter, being the arbiter of things, you watch some of the MPs on Twitter today, and they're raring to go. They see this as a good thing. They see the budget as a good thing. They see, the economic stewardship. That's, of course, going to be their key message throughout the campaign. They believe that they have the momentum and the message to take them through.
Elizabeth, what about it? Do the Conservatives really want this election? I know they say they don't, but what do you really think is going on?
Well, let's face it, 308 people just got added to the unemployment ranks, at least temporarily today. So there's got to be that bit of nervousness among a lot of them, because a lot of these Conservatives won by not very large margins in the last election. So they've got to be thinking about that. On the other hand, though, that budget was so carefully crafted and micro-targeted that a lot of them can take a look at that and take it to the doorstep and say, look, you're on guaranteed income supplement, we're going to give you some more money, and you're a volunteer firefighter, and guess what, you get a tax credit, and hey, your farm's got plum pox, we've got an app for that too, or we got a budget measure for that too. So a lot of them have been telling me privately that they think that there's enough in there that people will see hits them, that people will vote for that budget and that they'll be back.
Just for historical purposes, let's put up on the screen right now that which they actually voted on. Here is the House of Commons non-confidence motion as it was voted on earlier today, 156 to 145, carrying that the House agrees with the finding of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs that the government is in contempt of Parliament, which is unprecedented in Canadian parliamentary history, and consequently the House has lost confidence in the government. From your perch, Kathy, as someone who studies political history, tell us more about the significance of what was passed today by the House of Commons.
Well, it's pretty significant given that no other government has been found in contempt of Parliament. The reason why this is so significant is it goes back to the historic and the very early days of Parliament when it was actually a court. So just as you can be found in contempt of court, you can be found in contempt of Parliament. And that means you're preventing Parliament from doing its business. And the opposition parties are saying that the government wasn't playing nicely, it wasn't cooperating with them in an earnest and honest effort to get its legislation through, and that's why they thought they should bring the government down. That message, though, is a tricky one to deliver to the Canadian public, and it's one that could actually backfire on the Liberals.
Thomas, what's your view on that, on the significance of that resolution?
Oh, I think it was quite significant. It was contempt of Parliament is like impeachment in the U.S. It's a political crime. It's not a criminal crime. And that's why some of the controversy about the kangaroo court nature of the committee, which originally found the government in contempt, misses the point. But I think it is significant in that it brings together years and years of complaints about the Harper government, about its high-handed nature, about the way that it treats MPs, about the way that it treats individuals, people like Richard Colvin, the whistleblower, and the Afghan prisoner business. And it provides a focus, a political focus for that, for the opposition to take out into the campaign and to say, look, that kind of bully Stephen Harper that we've been talking about for years, yeah, that's who he is. And he is, in fact, such a bully that we found him and his government contemptuous of the entire parliamentary operation. And so I think it actually has quite a bit of real significance, and in a campaign, I think it can have real political significance if it's done correctly.
Adam, let me get you on that, the significance of a resolution which it appeared, at any rate, to kind of put a cherry on top for those who believe that this Prime Minister is a bully and that his government has run afoul.
Well, I disagree with Thomas in the sense that I don't think it's that significant for people outside of Ottawa. It's significant for historians, and it's important in the sense that it was done, and as Kathy said, it's the first time that it's ever happened. But people on the street, everyday Canadians, are just not talking about that.
How do you know?
They're not talking because I see the polls and I talk to people myself. The Carson scandal, the Oda scandal, these things just aren't catching on with people as big scandals. They're talking about the economy, they're talking about hockey, they're talking about things that everyday Canadians outside the inside baseball crowd would talk about. So I don't think it's going to be a significant campaign issue. In fact, I don't think you'll even hear about it after the first day of the campaign.
Well, let's follow up on this line of questioning then. Elizabeth, to you on this one. This government fell today on a contempt motion. It did not fall on a budget bill. Those were the two options, I guess. So the budget actually wasn't voted down. They were found guilty on contempt. Does that matter?
It doesn't, let's face it, when the campaign starts, it starts on one thing. When it ends, it takes on a life of its own by that point. One of the things, it may have fallen on contempt. However, one of the things I've seen this week that is quite interesting is one of the problems the Liberals had in the last campaign was selling the message at the door. When you ring that doorbell and someone opens the door, you have a very limited time to be able to sell your message. And one of the things I noticed this week is that Michael Ignatieff seems to have crafted a message that can be delivered quickly at the door. Basically, that the Harper government is spending so much on corporate tax cuts, on prisons and on planes, they've got no money left for average Canadian families. And that, it brings it on to the budget and the economic question. And it'll be interesting to see if they're actually able to take this to the door and be able to sell it.
Kathy Brock, let me get you on that. The message on day one is that this government was found to be in contempt of Parliament, and that's what's sending everybody off to the polls. Is that likely to be the story on day 37?
I doubt if that is the story. And one of the things that the Liberals are going to find is to try to bring that message home, they have to raise the issue of trust in the government and transparency. Well, two things have happened. One, we saw this week a poll on trust that shows that trust is declining in the Conservatives, and that could hurt them. But the Liberals are still carrying the stigma of the sponsorship scandal and other scandals in their government, so it's not clear that the vote is going to rebound to them. It might go to the NDP. The other thing that happened today that I thought was so significant was when Michael Ignatieff stood up in front of the press and they pressed him to say, are you going to engage in a coalition?
Okay, hold off on that. Kathy, hold off on that, because we're going to do a whole line of questioning on that as well. I still want to know at this point, and I'll go to Stephanie on this, do voters care who's responsible for having this election called?
To some extent, I believe they do. I mean, if you go back a little bit and you look at how the Tories came to power in the first place, didn't they come to power on ethics, on accountability? And that's a weakness of this motion being put in front of them right before a campaign, because they now lose that element of their strategy, which was always, well, we cleaned up government, and now the Liberals can turn it around and say, well, no, actually you didn't. And I think, it might resonate in the first few days. I agree with Elizabeth, though, that, to take it to the door, I don't know if people are listening, especially when you've got to start getting into, well, what does that mean? That means memos, that means, you know, all these intricacies of the parliamentary process that most Canadians just don't engage in.
Thomas, I think in our collective political experience, I mean the six of us here tonight, the one election that I suspect most people can agree on was unnecessary was the one called in Ontario by David Peterson in 1990. 3 years in, and he got punished for doing so. The notion of an unnecessary election on day one was definitely still there after day 37. So my question, now you're going to quibble with my premise here, aren't you?
I am actually, yeah.
Well, the premise was leading up to a question of, does it matter who gets blamed for calling this election?
No, I don't think so.
It doesn't.
I don't think it did even in the Peterson one, but you and I can have a private argument about that later. I think people generally get grumpy about the idea of elections, partly because they can't bear the idea of all those television ads. But after about a week, I think that goes away, and I don't think that becomes the issue. The bigger issue, I think, that you raised earlier, and that's the issue of the contempt motion. I mean, who knows? None of us know. None of us knows what will be the final issue on day 37 or day 36. But there is a sense out there, I think, about Stephen Harper, that if the Liberals and the NDP and the Bloc are clever, they can take advantage of. And that's where the contempt motion plays directly into that. It's not that people follow parliamentary procedure. People don't. But if this campaign is run skillfully by the opposition, they can make, I think, a great deal of use of that, because I think there is a notion out there about Harper. There are many notions about Harper, but one of them is that he is a little bit of a bully.
Adam, does it matter why we're going to the polls?
No, I don't think it does. And even if it did, I think people would forget about it after the first maybe week of the campaign. I think Kathy made a really astute point earlier, which is that the Liberals have to be very careful with playing the ethics card, because it could backfire on them, as she mentioned. It's sort of the pot calling the kettle black, and some of those votes could go to the NDP. In response to what Thomas just said, I think it's dangerous as well for the Liberals to go too far down the road of pushing on this question of Harper and whether or not he's a bully and is he an autocrat and whatnot. I think people that think Harper is a bully are already not voting for Stephen Harper. I don't think that's going to get a lot of political ground for the Liberals. So it's probably not a good strategy either. In fact, it's going to be very interesting. One of the most interesting things of this campaign is going to be to see what type of strategy the Liberals do adopt, because right now we don't know where they're going. It was about corruption, it was about trust, it was about ethics. Then Ignatieff yesterday, as was mentioned earlier, started talking about the overspending and not having enough money for families. I think it would be probably pretty advantageous for the Liberals to talk about spending, and there's probably even an opening to attack the Conservatives from the right on spending, given how happy and free spending they've been over the past couple of years.
Well, let's see if we can answer the question that I posed in the introduction, which is, what's this election all about anyway? Elizabeth, help us out with this off the top. What do the Conservatives want this election to be all about?
Economy, economy, economy.
That's it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there are a few other things as well, you know, coalition, but it was very clear with Mr. Harper today. He was very succinct in framing what he wants this campaign to be about, and he wants it to be about economy, the stability of the economy, and the scary coalition that you will end up with if you vote for the Liberals or the NDP.
Kathy Brock, we heard the Prime Minister also say this is an unnecessary election which could potentially damage the economy by going through all of this right now. Now, Thomas is an economist. I'm going to ask him on this one later as well, but let me get your take on that one. Is that a reasonable line of assertion?
Well, it is reasonable because he's thinking of it in the context of what's happening around the world, with what's happening in Japan, in the Middle East, Northern Africa. Those things could have a destabilizing effect on Canada, especially if you put them together with what's happening in Spain, with Portugal. It's now in a more serious circumstance. All of these things could have an economic impact on Canada. So the Prime Minister is trying to make people aware that Canada has to be careful in fragile world circumstances, but also he's playing to people on a very personal level. A lot of people are hurting. They're really feeling that they are stretched thin in this economy, and he's saying, you need a government that's steady as she goes. You know what we represent, so we're going to go ahead on that. I think that's the key message for the Prime Minister, and there is some validity to it, but I think the Liberals and the NDP are really going to be attacking him on that basis still.
Thomas, what do you think of the Prime Minister's argument that we cannot have an election now because it risks our recovery?
Well, I think the Prime Minister makes one good point, which is that the world recovery is very fragile. I think that's true. I don't think that he necessarily means that you can't have an election during such a period of time, although if he does mean that, he's wrong, because the election itself is not destabilizing. I think what he's really trying to say is that if you elect the wrong government at the end of this, you risk the recovery. I think that's really his message. I don't think, if you think about it rationally, I don't think that's necessarily true, because the Harper economic approach is almost identical to what the Liberal economic approach would have been to this recession, which takes me to the second point, which is why the Liberals can't really run on the economy. They have nothing really to complain about with Harper's handling of the economy.
Because he's done what they wanted.
He has done not just what they wanted, but what they probably would have done themselves. That's why for the Liberals, the only thing they can take, the only issue they can make in this campaign is Harper himself.
Okay.
For the Conservatives, of course, the economy. For the Liberals, Harper.
Well, that's where I want to go next. Stephanie, if the Liberals have their way, what's this election going to be about?
As Elizabeth pointed out earlier, it's going to be about spending, it's going to be about corporate tax cuts, it's going to be about fighter jets, it's to some extent going to be about seniors and money for them, and it is going to be about Harper. It's going to be about, painting a contrasting vision of politics for this country. And, the difference, I think, key in this election is that Harper and his budget and all of the politics of the Conservative Party, they're so targeted. Everything is micro this, micro that. The Liberals are back to promoting, Michael Ignatieff raised it again, the big red tent. This is a party for everybody. This is politics for everybody, not just the few and the mighty, as the Harper government might paint it. So I think that's a little bit where we're going to see Ignatieff go.
Adam, if the Liberals have their way, what will this election be about?
It'll be about trust. It'll be whether or not Stephen Harper, as the big bully, autocratic Prime Minister, can be trusted, and his spending, I think. The second one seems to be kind of a sub-theme at the moment, anyway, of the Liberal campaign, but I think they'd be well advised to put it more front and center, because I think the Conservatives are very vulnerable on the spending front.
I know that I presume the conventional wisdom is that really only the Conservatives or the Liberals can form a government after this next election takes place. But having said that, the leader of the NDP right now has some pretty solid personal polling numbers, and who knows, if it's a minority parliament, the leader of the NDP potentially is in a position of importance. So let's look at them for a while. Elizabeth, if the New Democrats have their way, what will this election be about?
It's going to be about making Ottawa work. It's going to be about standing up for families and the little guy. And I think it's very curious to see over the months, not just today when they were framing the message, but over the months, the party that has most consistently addressed things that would matter to everyday people who really don't care that much about politics, things like high credit card rates, things like protecting pensions when companies go bankrupt. Those are the things that I have seen the NDP focus on more, where the Liberals have been trying to look a bit more for scandal and stuff like that. The NDP has been focusing more on bread and butter issues, and it'll be interesting to see if that resonates with voters in this campaign, because it seems like from today, the kinds of things they were talking about are the same kind of bread and butter things that you see when you do your bills at the end of the month.
Stephanie, the conventional wisdom again is that the wind is at the back of the Conservatives right now. They're in the lead, they've got a lot of money, they're off to the races. How would you rate the NDP's, where the wind is, whether it's at their back or in their faces right now?
I agree with Elizabeth. I think, when people get tired of politics and they start saying, well, what about the policy? What about the policy? The NDP have been very strong in policy over the last few months. Even on the gun registry, which of course is an issue that will probably surface again in this election. And the NDP had a pretty spirited in-party debate about that. So they've been pretty clear about where they stand for things, and I think that's going to serve them well. And as you look at, how the parties are positioning for the election with Jack Layton, Jack sort of being the champion of the underdog, and I think he'll continue to play that role.
Kathy, let's get back to you now. I interrupted you earlier when you wanted to talk about how Michael Ignatieff, the Liberal leader, was reacting to the questions he got over the last couple of days about whether he'd be open to entertaining the idea of a coalition government with the NDP, potentially supported by the Bloc, if basically we're in a status quo situation. How do you think he's handled answering that question so far?
Well, I think we've just seen the first mistake of the campaign, to be quite honest, because he's saying that the Conservatives are not open The government has not been transparent. He's calling for more democracy. And then when he was pushed on a question that goes to the heart of democracy and parliamentary government, he refused to answer. So I think that's something he's going to have to deal with right up front, and he's going to have to say to Canadians that if we come in to government as a majority, which is unlikely, he won't say that though, but he'll say that's fine. But if he comes in with a minority, increased seats, then he's got to tell voters what he's going to do. So I think he made a big mistake today.
Adam, he's going to get the question wherever he goes. That's for sure, until he comes up with a more solid answer than he has over the last couple of days. If you were advising him, what would you tell him to say?
Well, it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, Steve. I mean, clearly what voters need to hear is that he won't have a coalition because it's bothering people and it makes him look indecisive and like he can't make up his mind. But we all know that if he does get a minority, and I think Kathy's right that the best Ignatieff can hope for is probably a minority government situation, that he probably would form a coalition in order to hold power. So it's really there's no good answer here. If he wants to get it out of the news, though, he's going to have to say something a little bit more decisive than he did today. And I think, politically speaking, just for the pure realpolitik of the situation, he's going to have to say he wouldn't do it. But we know that if he ever was forced to or had the opportunity to, he probably would. So it's pretty tough.
Thomas, what he said today was, there's a blue door and there's a red door, and you got to pick one of those doors. And people kept after him saying, you know, come on, are you open to a coalition or you're not? And he said, there's a blue door and there's a red door. Does he have to do better than that?
Well, he didn't do it very well, but I understand why he did what he did. Because, as Adam says, there's no good way out of this for him.
Why not just say, yes, I'm open to it?
Well, because if he says that, then people will think it's costless to vote for the NDP. What Ignatieff is trying to do is steal a bunch of Liberal NDP voters, get them to vote Liberal. But if you think, oh, okay, I can go and vote for the NDP, and they'll end up in part of Ignatieff's coalition anyway, he'll go ahead and do that. So he doesn't want to do that. He wants
then rule
to
it out.
Well, and that the other part of it is that realistically, he can't. And I don't know what a good answer is, but you can't know until the end. Maybe the good answer is that it's a hypothetical question, because you can't know until the end of the campaign what the dynamics are, whether it's even politically possible to form a coalition, or whether you'd want to if you were in another minority parliament. Let's say, for example, that Ignatieff did win a sizable minority, the plurality of seats.
So he comes first.
So that he comes first.
Okay.
He might find it more advantageous to govern as Harper did, that is, as a minority government. Or conversely, the NDP may not be willing to go into a coalition with the Liberals, or even an accord with the Liberals. All of that depends on how it shakes down at the end, how the campaign has been viewed, who's seen to have won, who's seen to have lost. Ignatieff simply can't answer any of those questions, and I guess if he could figure out a way to say that and make himself sound sincere,
in 15 seconds.
That would be the best thing to do.
Yeah. Kathy, I saw you shaking your head during Tom's answer. How come?
Well, I think he could have an answer, and that is he could shift the language a little bit. He could talk about an alliance, because if you look at Canadians' voting preferences and when they get upset, it's when there's a formal coalition or an accord. We saw that in Ontario. We've seen that nationally now. But if he talked about just an alliance where he's going to work together with the other parties so that they support him on specific measures, he doesn't undercut the confidence convention so that other parties can defeat his government if they can't hold the confidence of the House. But he does signal very strongly that he's going to play with the other parties. So the language of an alliance is softer, and he could say that it's going to be vote specific, and that Canadians will accept.
Well, Elizabeth, I want to keep pursuing this a little bit, because the world's changed a lot since the attempts to form the coalition happened a couple of years ago. First of all, there is a coalition government in the mother country, right? Great Britain's got a coalition government, and there is another coalition government. Doesn't Australia have one as well? Another coalition government somewhere in the world? I think Australia.
There are coalition governments everywhere, Steve.
Yeah, so it's not that extraordinarily rare anymore. Does that help Mr. Ignatieff give an answer? Doesn't seem to be so far.
The sense I got today is one of the reasons he was skirting the question is one of the appeals he made was to progressive conservatives who were wondering where the progressive had gone and come join the big red tent. And I think that if he's trying to appeal to that particular demographic, then the prospect of a possible coalition down the road with the NDP might scare those potential voters off. I think, though, that there is an undercurrent in both of the parties, the Liberals and the NDP, of people who realize, look, the right is now united. The left is divided, or the left of center is divided. And as long as the left is divided, then they're going to be at a disadvantage in almost any election. So that, I think, has been brewing ever since that. And I think that the next time, if there is a next time, they'll be much more careful about whatever involvement the Bloc Québécois would have, because I think that potentially a Liberal NDP coalition might have flown, but Harper very carefully and almost surgically went after the presence of the Bloc and at the photo ops and things like that. And even though technically the proposed coalition was Liberal and NDP with the Bloc supporting them on key measures, what Harper was able to convince people it was about was that it was a coalition of three parties, including a party that stands for the separation of Quebec from Canada.
Now, we know, Stephanie, that tomorrow morning the Prime Minister is going to go visit the Governor General, David Johnston, at 9 o'clock. Then he's going to have his news conference at 9:30. So Michael Ignatieff will probably be up in front of the microphones around 10 o'clock. And my guess is one of your first questions, if you get a chance to ask him, is, are you open, if you come second in the next election, to a coalition? What kind of an answer does he have to give that's going to satisfy that press gallery? Because they're going to be after him every day.
And I mean, that's the question. I think Ignatieff, it's very much a sort of darned if you do, darned if you don't type scenario. And one of the risks also facing Ignatieff is Ignatieff. He's an unknown, he's an untested component on the election trail, and how he plays out these first few days and first few questions could very well set the tone, at least for the first couple of weeks. And the answer has to be perhaps what Thomas suggested. I don't know, it's a hypothetical. The other idea that let's go with an alliance as opposed to the evil word coalition. And, perhaps, one of the things Ignatieff could also address is the I don't know factor, the alliance factor, or let's just wait and see.
Here's what I need to understand. Thomas, in 2004, when Paul Martin won a minority government, Stephen Harper, Jack Layton, and Gilles Duceppe wrote a letter to the Governor General saying, incidentally, if this guy can't keep the confidence of the House, we're ready to step right in. Now, what's the difference between that and what the Conservatives are railing against today?
Well, the difference is that the Liberals didn't take them on about it. And the difference, and in I guess it was, 2008, the Conservatives did take them on and took them on very successfully on this idea. And Paul Martin didn't. I was in the UK, by the way, during the election last year that elected that government. And it's interesting to note that during that campaign, both Labour and the Conservative Party, the major parties, insisted that they would not form coalitions. And after the results came out, both of them were in negotiations with a third party, the Liberal Democrats, to form a coalition. And eventually there was a Conservative Liberal Democratic coalition. My point essentially is that the original point that I made, that if you can think of an answer, if Mr. Ignatieff can think of an answer that is sufficiently vague, but that will put off Tonda McCharles, my colleague, and others asking him that question, that's the best thing he can do, because he may want to form a coalition.
Okay, so Kathy, come on in here and help us with this. We have seen this movie before. It happened in 2004. For some reason back then, the Conservatives say it was okay. Today, they say, heaven forbid a coalition comes in backed by the Bloc Québécois, it would be sacrilege. What's the difference?
They're now in power.
The which?
They're now in power.
Oh, they're now in power.
The Conservatives. So things shift from where you sit. If you're in government, holding the reins of power, or if you're not. That's the flippant answer. But I guess what they're looking at now is their strength in Quebec, that they're trying to come up, the weakness of the Liberals vis-a-vis the Bloc, and they're saying, okay, we've got a little bit of movement here, that if we start to talk hard on this measure, we could actually win some voters, particularly around Quebec City. So they're playing a little bit to that, and then that message plays well in the rest of Canada. So I think that's important. One thing to bear in mind about the British example right now is that coalition is very shaky. When their budget was announced, we saw the members of the coalition sitting there very stony-faced. They were not happy about it at all. Prime Minister Cameron had pretty much forced through his measures. So if that coalition backfires, then that could play into the Conservative message, and they could really reinforce how problematic coalitions are. That's why I think the better message for the Liberals is that an alliance supporting, working with the other parties on particular measures and creating a cooperative atmosphere in the House. Canadians seem to like that.
Now I see Adam Daifella shaking his head. How come?
Because in theory it's great, in practice it's a disaster. Any talk of anything remotely similar to the word coalition, such as an alliance, would just trigger the Conservative communications machine into high gear, and they would pulverize the Liberals by saying, oh, alliance, it was a coalition yesterday, it's an alliance today. That just wouldn't work. And if one thing's been clear over the past few years, it's that the Tories, the federal Tories in Canada, have become one of the most polished and professional communications organizations of any of the political parties in the West. They're tremendously effective, especially with negative campaign tactics. And I think anything going down this road at all would be major trouble for the Liberals. The best strategy for them would be to say, as someone mentioned, I think earlier, that if you oppose Harper and you want the left of center vote united, it's best to vote for us. But to talk about working with other parties or any kind of words that resemble coalition would be big, big trouble.
Well, I'm going to go back to Stephanie on this because once again I'm trying to figure out her strategy for tomorrow morning at the Governor General's. I know what she's going to ask Michael Ignatieff if she sees him. My question now is, if you manage to get a question into Stephen Harper, are you going to point out the hypocrisy of the Conservative position on this?
Yeah, and because the question is, I mean, as was raised earlier, why was a coalition not a bad thing, before, and why is it such an evil word now? And what's the problem? Why do they demonize a coalition? Why are you so against it? And that would be the question. How do you take that back to your voters, Mr. Harper? Why is a coalition problematic a few years ago and not problematic a few years ago and such an issue now?
Elizabeth, I'm sure that question has been asked of many, not just the PM, but of many ministers as well. What's the stock answer they give you as to why it was okay back then, but so evil today?
Well, first of all, we don't get to ask them very many questions. They don't tend to be very present, and unfortunately, Mr. Harper's choice today to make a statement with no questions happens more often than not. One of the things that sort of runs through my mind as we're talking about all of this is, how come it's okay for the Progressive Conservatives and the Canadian Alliance, which used to sort of be the Reform Party, to come together into one party to work together on the right of centre, and yet they demonize the Liberals and the NDP for the possibility that maybe down the road they may choose to work together?
And do they have an answer for that?
I do.
I haven't asked the question yet.
Okay.
If we
Tom?
get to ask questions to Mr. Harper tomorrow and they aren't pre-selected to specific reporters, I will be glad to ask that question.
Terrific. Okay. Tom has the answer, though. What is it?
I have the answer to that, Elizabeth's question.
Go ahead.
The answer is that if you form in effect a united party ahead of time, that's fine. That's legitimate. People know what they're voting for. But if you campaign as separate parties and then come together afterwards, that is illegitimate. I don't happen to think that, but that's the argument they would make.
Kathy, do people understand in this country that when they go to the polls, whenever it happens, May 2nd, May 9th, are the dates we're hearing right now, that they're not voting for a government? They're voting to create a parliament, and that whoever wins the most number of seats gets the first shot at putting together a government. Do they get that?
Well, Steve, I don't think people really think about it that closely. They see themselves as voting for a party, for a leader, and essentially making government. So I don't think they make the fine distinctions that they are voting for a parliament instead.
The reason I asked the question, Adam, and I think it's an important question because there's nothing in Canadian history that suggests that a coalition, or we'll use whatever word you want, alliance, a getting together, of the second, third, and fourth place parties, if they hold the majority of the seats, is illegitimate. Isn't that right?
Oh, it's not illegitimate at all. It's perfectly legitimate according to Westminster parliamentary tradition, and it may well happen. It's just that politically speaking, in terms of communications strategy and what works, the Conservatives clearly have information showing that the combination of Ignatieff with Layton and Duceppe working together, and they use the word, the Liberal NDP separatist coalition all the time, that idea is very popular with, very unpopular with Canadians, especially the ones that are sort of in the middle ground, the ones that they're trying to wean over to get those extra few votes that they need to form a majority government. So I don't think it has anything to do really with the moral right or wrong of it, or whether it's okay or not in our parliamentary tradition. It's just pure politics.
Well, okay, Elizabeth, let me follow up on that, because, you know, I hear this on the streets. I hear this when I go on the subway. I hear people come up to me saying, isn't that illegal? And certainly, wouldn't that be immoral if there were a government of Canada made up by the second and third place parties and backed up by a separatist party? Now, that's not illegal, is it?
As far as I know, it's not illegal. The optics of the bloc joining in with the other two is what Mr. Harper pounced on. One thing to bear in mind in this debate as well, though, when this happened in the UK and a coalition was the result, Mr. Harper was asked about it at that point, and he said he didn't see anything wrong if the party that came first chose to form a coalition with one of the other parties. And so he seemed to feel in his mind that as long as the party initiating the coalition was the one that came first, then it was legitimate in his mind. So I guess some coalitions in his mind are legitimate and some appear not to be.
Okay, let's, enough of the coalition talk right now. Let's move on to this. Thomas, I'm going to go to you first on this. The budget. The budget really seemed to be, in some respects, a 1 or a 2 day story, because suddenly it got bypassed by this ethics resolution that went before the House today, and the contempt resolution passed, and so we're on to an election campaign, at least at the beginning, on an issue of contempt. However, the Conservatives have, as was pointed out earlier, targeted a lot of their goodies in the budget to various specific groups. Parents who've got their kids in piano lessons, seniors, and so on. Do you think, characterize that strategy, if you would, for me, of doing politics that way?
Well, I think the two things about the Conservative budget, there's the macro part of it and the micro part. And the micro part's what you're talking about. And they've done that before. They've targeted specific groups before, and they've done it again this time. And it's political, of course. Budgets are political.
It's politically smart?
Of course it's politically smart.
It is.
And it's designed to get votes in certain ridings, because they only need a few more seats if they keep all the ones they've got now to get a majority. So that's the micro part of it. The macro part of the budget is it's a steady-as-she-goes budget. And that, in fact, is quite in line with the orthodoxy of most countries, with the exception of the UK and Germany right now. The Americans aren't able to do it. But if you ask, for instance, the International Monetary Fund what kind of budget you should have, they would say a kind of steady-as-she-goes budget. Don't make big cuts now, but think of making big cuts later. That's why I said it's the kind of budget actually the Liberals would like if they'd been in power. But on the politics of it, yeah, if they've targeted correctly, it'll get them votes.
Kathy, let me get you to follow up in the way that Thomas has. Never mind, let's leave the macro aside for now, but on the micro, on targeting specific programs for, individually targeted groups in society. What would you say is the, political advisability of doing that?
I think this is a really smart budget to do that. He's putting forward programs like home care that'll help people that are feeling stressed as they care for elderly parents. The firefighters program to help out firefighters, that's one that really plays well in the community, so that'll bring back some of the rural vote that has slipped away a bit and give people an incentive to go out. So some of these measures are really strong for them, I think. The other interesting thing about it is the NDP was really going to come out on the measures they tried to get in the budget. I think they're still going to come out on that. And that means in some of the ridings where the Conservatives and the NDP are fighting, it's going to be a real fight. And the Conservatives are trying to take the edge away from the NDP there.
Okay, let's get into some discussion here, just in our last 8 or 9 minutes or so, on this. And Michael, let's bring up this poll. This is Nick Nanos's poll. And boy, if this doesn't sum it all up in one poll, the question asked is, what is most important to you? And there were a couple of options offered. The government's record on how transparent it is. 48% of the people said that's what's important to us. How about managing the economy? 47% of the people said that was most important to them. It's a dead heat. And how about the rest? 5% unsure, and they're the ones who are going to be watching this campaign very carefully. So as the parties, Adam, to you first on this, as the parties try to frame the ballot question, at the moment it seems like a dead heat between those who care about transparency and ethics and those who care about the economy. So where does that leave us?
Well, I think it leaves us exactly where we are, in the sense that the Conservatives are trying to run on the economy, and it looks like the Liberals are going to go down the road of focusing more on transparency and ethics. I'm actually surprised to see the transparency and ethics option scoring so well in that poll. And I think it's probably because of what's been in the news for the last month or so with the ODA issue and Bruce Carson and the other scandals. But I think as the campaign goes on, that issue is probably going to fade a little bit, and it'll shift much more strongly towards the economy, jobs, and growth and whatnot, especially if anything happens economic newsy-wise in the U.S. Or in particular. So that probably benefits the Conservatives. But there's no question that at this very moment, and a poll, as we know, a poll is always just a snapshot in time, but at this very moment, transparency and ethics is a question on the mind of a lot of voters.
Adam, I'm going to tease you a little bit here because I think we've done about 1,010 programs here on the agenda, and I'm not sure I've ever heard the expression economic newsy-wise before. So that's a new one. We like that one. Okay. Okay, right. Stephanie, come on in behind that one. You know, a dead heat right now between managing the economy and the importance of transparency and ethics. Where does that leave us tonight?
I don't think that those two things are actually mutually exclusive, because the Liberals are also going to go after the costing of the crime agenda. They're going to go after the costing on the F-35s, and how the Tories have, you know, failed to sort of come forward with how much those things are going to cost. And on the flip side, the Tories will go after the Liberals for saying, well, you're going to introduce maybe some of these new programs. Well, how exactly do you think you're going to pay for them? So I think it's about, you know, overall, how clearly do Canadians know how the government is managing their money? How the government's managing taxpayer money, and then that's the transparency and ethics part of it. And then there's the secondary part of it. How well is the government looking after me and making sure that I have a job, that my kids are looked after, that my mother-in-law is looked after, and that's the economy part of the equation.
Thomas, how do you see that, or what do you infer from the way that polling split right down the middle?
Well, I think that's correct that at some level they're interrelated. I also think, by the way, that the economic question is perhaps not necessarily as easy for the Conservatives as we've all been assuming.
How come?
Well, if the economy were doing really well, then of course you take credit for it and you just say, well, business as usual. If the economy is doing really badly, then usually the government's blamed. But our economy is kind of in the middle. It's not doing that well, but it has not collapsed. So it's not clear that the Conservatives can claim credit for very much. At the same time, it's not clear that they can be blamed for very much. So they're in I think, more of a difficult position playing the economy card than we all assume.
Let me follow up with Elizabeth on that. And Elizabeth, I'm going to give you some new polling numbers to chew on here. Again, according to Nick Nanos, who's one of the really good pollsters out there, only 4% of respondents cited debt and deficits as their top concern, compared with 29% who said health care should be the top national priority. Now, we've got the Conservatives talking economy, we've got the Liberals talking ethics. Is this, you know, does this demonstrate that perhaps both of these main parties in Canada are out of touch with what the concerns of Mr. and Mrs. Everyday Canada really are?
Well, one of the things that Mr. Ignatieff has been talking about is having a compassionate government. The NDP has also been talking about measures such as that. One of the things that I think that may come up in this election, one thing that people should probably bear in mind is it is entirely likely that whichever government is elected is the one that will be renegotiating the healthcare accords with the provinces. And the government that is chosen, depending on the government that's chosen, that could mean a very different accord from one or the other.
Kathy, what do you infer from the way that very few people seem to have debt and deficits up there? A lot of people had health care up there, and neither of those two parties are talking that at all right now.
Well, I think that's exactly right, that the health accord is looming over the Conservatives or the Liberals, whoever has to negotiate it. And that's a really tough measure because those costs are rising in the provinces. The provinces have signaled they're going to put a lot of pressure on the federal government. So I don't think the two main parties really want to lock themselves in on that. And when you look at the Nanos poll that split between the trust and the handling of the economy, it's not clear that people think that the Liberals win out on the question of trust, in which case even those people are going to say, well, who's the better manager of the economy? And the polls tend to show that people think the Conservatives are, and in particular, Stephen Harper is a better manager. So I think that poll actually doesn't reveal enough. We need to dig a little deeper when we're thinking about it and how Canadians will vote.
Elizabeth, you want to follow up on that? It is a fact that, well, I shouldn't say it's a fact. It's possible that the Conservatives are vulnerable on this issue of trust and ethics. but do people trust the Liberals anymore, given their recent history with the sponsorship scandal, etc.?
Well, the question that voters will have to decide is, have the Liberals spent enough time in the penalty box over the sponsorship scandal? The other thing that I think will also possibly come to bear in this campaign is, when you're the incumbent government, that can be a tremendous advantage. You get to do all those ads we've been seeing with the Conservative government, but it can also be a very big disadvantage as well, because surprises can come up and bite you on the election campaign, and they've been in office long enough now that they can't plead, well, that was the previous administration. We've seen this a bit with the Bruce Carson affair, where it seems to be, you know, new things are coming out daily. Canadian Press is doing some great work on it. The original network, APTN, did some very interesting investigative work on that. There may be more that's going to come out there. And there is a big suspicion in the corridors here in Ottawa that if it looks like the Liberals might win a government, or that the Conservatives might lose, that all of a sudden the civil service may decide that it's payback time, that also all of a sudden the brown envelopes will start flying. And if that's the case, then I think that this could be a very unpredictable campaign, especially towards the second half of it.
Now, as promised off the top of the program, I've got a minute left here, and I want to talk about Peter Milliken, because he is the longest-serving Speaker of all time. He's not running again. I must say I found quite moving today, as he was walking into Parliament for the very last time, into the House of Commons, people were lined up in the corridors, applauding loudly, chanting his name, pages, people who were working at the Assembly. It was really quite something to see. The guy's been there since 1988, not Speaker for all of that time, but for a good chunk of that time. He's the longest serving one ever. Kathy, you're from Kingston. That's his home turf. Take 30 seconds and tell me about Peter Milliken.
Well, Peter Milliken is probably one of the most respected Speakers of the House of Commons that we've ever had. He's been elected to that position twice by all of the parties, and you could see how much the parties respect him. He's given very fair, nonpartisan rulings. Even when the Conservatives criticized him the other day, a couple of members of the Conservative Party started to criticize him for the contempt ruling. The other people in the Conservative Party immediately cut them off because they felt he'd done a good job. He's been a tremendous parliamentarian, and he started that from the time he was little. He loved Parliament. He wanted to be Speaker of the House of Commons. He achieved his dream, and Canadians benefited from it. He's going to be hard to replace.
The NDP's Libby Davies says today he's probably going to wake up in his sleep going, order, order from now on. But anyway, thanks everybody for joining us tonight, as it all starts tomorrow. Very nice to have you all on the program. Adam Difala from Montreal, Elizabeth Thompson and Stephanie Levitz in Ottawa, Kathy Brock at Kingston's Queen's University, Thomas Walcom from the Toronto Star here in our studios. Thanks so much, everybody. Appreciate your time tonight.